welcome to this segment of the Rip-Off of the Week. My name is Adam Angievsky, and I'm the CEO and founder of OpenTheBooks.com. We've got a great topic for you this week. It's those Democratic mayors in the big cities that defunded the police protection for the people, yet took millions of dollars, oftentimes, of police protection for themselves. And we've got a special guest this week as well, which I'll get to in a second. First off, I just want to review our mission at OpenTheBooks.com. Our mission, simply said, is our mission is just open the books. It's to put every dime online in real time. You know that last year we filed 40,000 Freedom of Information Act requests and captured successfully $6 trillion worth of federal, state, and local spending. And we do this so you can follow the money, so you can hold the political class accountable for tax and spend decisions. All right, I want to get right to our special guest. This is very exciting here today. So we have Emily Compadio, and she is the permanent host of Outnumbered. It's the midday, 12 noon Eastern Fox News program. Here's a little bit of background on Emily. She graduated from the University of Washington. She got her law degree in 2006 from San Francisco School of Law, and she went into criminal defense practice. She's a serious person. Yet at the same time, she was an NFL cheerleader for the Oakland Raiders. Actually, she served as captain of the team. This afforded her some opportunities through the NFL to go overseas to join our men and women in forward bases like in Iraq and Kuwait. Emily has a deep affinity for our first responders and for our men and women in the United States military. And I think she'd say it's generational. Her great-grandfather in World War I was awarded the Silver Star. In 2018, Emily came aboard Fox News as their legal analyst, and frequently she co-hosted programs such as The Five. In January of this year, she got the permanent co-host position on Outnumbered at Fox News. Emily's a serious person and yet delivers the message in a way that's smart, concise, and that people are able to understand. They can follow her, and she's exactly what Ronald Reagan, I believe, had in mind when he said that we have to be happy warriors. Without further ado, Emily Compadio. Hey, Emily, you spearheaded this police story over at Fox News. What do you think resonated about the story with you and then henceforth with the American people?
Well, first of all, Adam, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm still working on the concise part, but that's a work in progress. I spearheaded that story over at Fox because of your hard work and because of the amazing work at Open the Books, right? All I am is an amplifier of the illuminating work that you guys are doing over there. And to answer your question, I think, frankly, it was the hypocrisy and the audacity on the part of these mayors, right? So yes, of course, public and personal safety, those are fundamental. We knew this all along, people like you and I, reasonable, normal people, as well as those of us who have been working towards a fundamental criminal justice system reform, right? But that would have been done by investing in law enforcement, in investing in resources, thoughtful policymaking, not divesting resources, not stripping police budgets and therefore of safety. And the audacity, I think, what's so incredible for those of us who are living in these cities is the fact that these characters thought that they could get away with it when all of this is public budget and all of this is our money. And I think it's also interesting that we saw that trickling down, not just to existing mayors, but also even to candidates. So look at Maya Wiley, for example, who ran for mayor of New York City on a platform of defunding the police budget there, and yet paid out of her own pocket for private security in her neighborhood, which she at the time explained away to her husband's trauma from being attacked 10 years prior. So there's always a reason, right? There's always an exception to be made for that person when you call them out. But I think what it boils down to is what I said in the beginning, which is that we all know personal and public safety are, yes, absolutely fundamental.
So kind of on the home turf over there, you have Seattle over there on the West Coast, kind of home turf for you and Mayor Jenny Durkan over there, who has taken steps to defund the city of the Seattle police. Furthermore, they had in Seattle last summer a pretty unique operation going there on the street where the police kind of left the neighborhood. Can you speak to Jenny Durkan and what she's done to defund the police and some of the things that And then also, with hypocrisy, the police detail that she's taken in Seattle.
Absolutely, I'm happy to. So that CHOP, the autonomous zone, as it was called, which is 15 blocks, by the way, from where I'm sitting, just that direction. Mayor Jenny Durkan at the time, remember, she talked to Anderson Cooper at CNN. She called it, quote, a summer of love, but it was anything but here. So let's just take one case study, and this isn't even including the homicides, Adam, that were incurred, especially including children, literally teenagers that were shot, and two of them succumbed to their shooting injuries there. So in that CHOP autonomous zone, this is again just one case study. One small business owner there, while it was happening, he owned an auto body shop. And he watched while protesters broke into his auto body shop, ransacked it, set it on fire, and then they attacked him and his son. He called 911 over a dozen times. No one showed up. No police, no fire. And then more protesters broke down the fence around the auto body shop and essentially surrounded him and his son and demanded that they let the perp go, who had a box cutter and slashed, thankfully, just his son's clothes. Now, at the time, this business owner said, quote, nobody showed up when literally our lives are on the line. I think the mayor and governor need to get their act together because this is beyond a protest. Now, talk about stating the obvious. You and I have talked before that those business owners, those residents who were stripped of their police protection, their EMS services, their also ability to conduct business, right? They had their livelihoods taken away. They sued. They sued essentially for dereliction and abdication of duty, but the courts eventually threw it out because that emergent situation resolved itself when eventually, after weeks, the area was cleared and the police were allowed to move back into the East Precinct, which is one Seattle police officer told me was his home. He had served in Iraq. He had been served in combat. And he said that, however, was the saddest day of his life, was having to leave that East Precinct and essentially desert his fellow American citizens. Now, here's the irony as well about then Mayor Jenny Durkan, who at the time was advocating for defunding the police, but she wasn't advocating enough. So she vetoed a bill that the city council put forth that totally decimated the budget. She vetoed it, and then they overrode it, and so it got passed. Mayor Durkan was essentially advocating for less of a defunding and diversion of funds, which is still defunding, by the way. She was called at the time a bully and an anti-Black obstructionist. So that goes to show just the climate, too, that we're dealing with here in this city and in many cities where, as I call it, the buffet of socialism or the buffet of incompetence. So no matter where you fall on that spectrum, it's all incompetent and it's all totally unacceptable for a tax-paying citizen. Now, Mayor Durkan has two details, by the way, that tax dollars pay for at her $7.5 million house. She has an executive protection unit, right, that mayors are afforded, and she also has uniformed cops. But here's the other irony, that when cops call in sick or are unable to perform duty there in the precincts, her detail gets precedence. So even more than the defunding already did, which thinned the ranks, all of the retirements and the fleeing to other communities, whereas one police officer told me he knows he's wanted, even more than that, her detail will eradicate the ranks because if less people show up to work there, her details are still staffed. There's no bathroom on her details. There's no cell service. So as one police officer said, you just sit there and stare and think about how crappy your life is for 4 or 5 hours. I mean, you can't write this as fiction. And yet, unfortunately, this is the reality here in just one example of all the cities you uncovered.
Such a lack of respect for the police. That's unbelievable. So we see this in places like San Francisco as well. So San Francisco Mayor London Breed, she presided over $120 million defunding of the San Francisco Police Department. Yet our Freedom of Information Act request for the costs of her personal protective detail staffed by the police were up nearly $1 million over a 5-year period. Taxpayers in San Fran spent $2.6 million protecting the mayor that had defunded the police for the people in the neighborhoods. So what is it? What is it, Emily, about places like Seattle and San Francisco, and let's throw Los Angeles into the mix?
Let's throw in the trifecta. I think, Adam, that it stems from a war of the compassionate approaches. I think that obviously we know that the West Coast has a liberal seat from which these actors operate. And I think there is a time at which compassion bleeds over into cruel. And I think that we're seeing that here as you see the tension between wanting to support those who are engaging in crimes. They call it poverty crimes. Sure, there are those who are championing for social justice and the like, while also having to honor the tax-paying citizens that depend on law and order for a safe, efficient society, right? But the tension's pretty clear. And I think that line, it's not quite so fine. So even here I saw, for example, a huge homeless encampment that was being built that was taking the city power. So again, taxes are paying for this power in order to for it to go. These guys were all plugged into it. And I saw the next door homeowner building a fence between that home and the encampment. So how many times over does that person's tax dollars have to pay for that protection? I think as well, it's not just the elected officials in terms of the executive branch, but also take Chisa Boudin, the district attorney in San Francisco, LA District Attorney Gascon, who are now abdicating their duties, and they are failing and refusing to prosecute certain crimes that would then be able to be prosecuted with deterrent consequences that would enable us all to live safely. So as we're diverging funds as well from what they call, let's just say, police operations, that also is taking away from how society operates. So crime investigation, over time, that leads to a certain licensure that officers need, like here in Seattle, piloting boats, scuba and the like. I mean, there are so many other, I think, frankly, unintended consequences, but that really illustrate how multifaceted this is. But at its heart, I think it's, yes, stemming from that war of the compassionate approach and a capitulation to the really loud progressive left mob that is unfortunately sort of taking over Twitter and similar social media situations.
So everybody that comes back on a reoccurring basis every single week to this segment of the ripoff of the week, you heard it first last Thursday on this Defund the Police, yet the mayor's taking big police details. You know, it was protection for me, but not for thee. You heard it first on the ripoff of the week. We put the column up at Forbes. We broke it on TV with actually Sinclair, 190 ABC, NBC, CBS stations. Emily championed it, Fox, pushed it to about 7 or 8 Fox shows. She was on 3 of them. And now it's actually having a big impact in the cities on policy. So over in Los Angeles, you've got a candidate that wants to take over as mayor, and he swore off a police detail because the police have been defunded. Over in New York City, Eric Adams, he's the heir apparent on the Democratic side coming out of the primary. He swore off a police detail because the police in New York City have been defunded. And so we're seeing that this story now has real world application. Emily, when you're in New York City, and I'm sure you're there frequently in Midtown Manhattan at Fox News headquarters, what's the feeling on the street today in New York City? You know, do you feel safe on the streets of Midtown Manhattan?
I have to admit that it feels much different than it did before. I don't feel as safe as I did. There are certain areas that I now avoid for sure, that I used to do all my errands in and whatnot. And the couple times that I've had to go through it, I've seen things that I wish I hadn't seen. I've seen in some places an increase of police presence, but I know by statistics that's a concentration of such because they've been absolutely gutted otherwise. So I think the answer is I've changed my behavior there in the city, and a lot of people have as well. Our employees still don't take the subway. They get Uber vouchers so they can ride in. I mean, the city is much better than it used to be months ago. It's a slow change, but definitely it's nowhere near the New York that I remember of March 2020.
So in New York City, there was $1 billion cut put through the city council on a $6 billion police budget. Now, a lot of those cuts haven't materialized yet. However, we do know that the mayor, de Blasio, his wife, and his son all have police details, but they're not coming through with the detail on our Freedom of Information Act request. It's been 11 weeks. They still haven't responded, Emily, to the details in New York City on how much they're paying for de Blasio and his family on their personal police protective detail.
I'm not surprised they haven't responded, even though they need to. That's par for the course with the lack of transparency there and de Blasio's ineptitude. I will say the irony too, Adam, is that $1 billion is actually an accurate accounting because it takes into account the ancillary benefits that weren't counted in the original defunding. Now, this, for example, squishes 2 of what would have been 4 recruiting classes of New York police department officers. And well, it basically eradicates about 1,500 police officer positions. It also takes $500,000 away from the police department from major projects and gives it to youth centers, high-speed internet for public housing residents. So there was so much of these consequences that I keep talking about where it goes beyond, when we say defund, what exactly does that mean? I keep circling back to as well investigating those crimes. But the irony too as well here is that, okay, so we know that the mayor has private security for himself and his family to the taxpayer tune, but also even as far back as 2019, he was using his publicly funded security detail to drive his son back and forth to Yale 8 or 9 times and to move his daughter out of her apartment in Brooklyn. When called out as well, a source said that specifically there was no threat to these guys. This was just out of nowhere. But this kind of dovetails in with that audacity we talked about earlier, right? That hubris, that until these guys get called out on it, they're just going to proceed for thee and not me, as you said. And I also have to point out that, we saw this in 2008, right? There was a recession and a lot of city councils sort of defunded police precincts without really explaining or articulating exactly how that would affect or in what detail. And we saw back then too, the rise in crime spikes, everything, the community outreach dwindled, cops that were forced to work high amounts of overtime. So ironically, then the taxpayers paid even more for it, right? And in Memphis, for example, overtime costs doubled, reaching $27 million 2 years later. So it's sort of a pound and a penny and a cure and whatever that saying is, that we're seeing that ultimately it costs us more. And just quick final point that these court-ordered consent decrees that the DOJ, the Department of Justice, is invested in a lot of these cities, including Seattle, that's a form of criminal justice reform, right? A lot of people were advocating for that in the wake of shooting deaths and whatnot to reform these police departments. Well, who do you think pays for those? Those cost millions of dollars, and there's currently about 70 in operation around the country, including Seattle, where when we defunded our police, the federal judge who oversaw that consent decree at the moment said, you just set us back 3 steps. So now, again, this is extending the taxpayer dollar. This is rising the costs for an unintended consequence that also, unfortunately, sacrifices public safety.
Exactly. I'm glad you went to the defunding the police diminishes the headcounts on the street and of police officers and how important that is. So here, openthebooks.com is headquartered in Illinois, the Super Bowl of corruption. So we remember when Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel quietly cut the headcount of Chicago police officers on the street by 1,000 cops. And during that period, homicides and shootings spiked. There were more homicides in 1 year under Rahm Emanuel, about 750, than in the cities of New York and Los Angeles combined. So Lori Lightfoot in 2020, height of the pandemic, social unrest looming in the streets of Chicago, we just found that she had cut the head count quietly of 400 Chicago police officers. So while all that was going on, there was 400 less cops defending the city during that period.
And keep in mind, too, that when we also talk about now that these mayors are asking to refund a lot of these police departments that they initially called to defund, for example, we're seeing that in LA, in Portland, Seattle as well, Detroit and the like, that a lot of these police officers have retired. They have gone elsewhere, right? So it's not even just the ones that have been cut squarely, but a lot are leaving on their own volition. Because now remember the calls for example, to do away with qualified immunity. We saw an actual criminal prosecution for assault there in the state of Georgia. There are things happening to these guys legally that really opens them up to legal vulnerability beyond just these egregious cases that we see in the news where everyone agrees there needs to be a higher culpability and accountability. So by these deterrent consequences, essentially that these elected officials are engaging in means that as they lose the ranks and the ranks thin, they take away money, there's less police officers, then there's also none who wants to be a cop now, right? For both safety purposes and for also that protection. I think that's another consequence that we're going to see. And you're absolutely right about the crime spikes. I think, frankly, the statistics that I talk about on a daily basis on my show are so mind-boggling that it's hard to wrap your brain around. It's hard to really, I think people get numb to it really horrifyingly as they see triple-digit increases in homicides, in shootings, 15-year highs in all of these cities. And we don't have an administration that is being clear and transparent with it. Take DC, for example, Mayor Bowser, who also defunded the police and then diverted it towards what she called volunteer justice, and then a volunteer, essentially, community forum in place of that. And she said, well, this is representative of my approach, that this is a public health crisis, these spikes in crime. But as we talked about in 2008, or as we referenced in 2008, we've seen this pattern before, and it's a lot more than a public health crisis. It's just a crisis.
Well, Emily, for the entire Open the Books Nation, we appreciate your advocacy, taking this story, driving it through the Fox News network that put millions and millions of regular Americans, their eyes on this story. And I think that you are really shining a white hot spotlight. We're shining the light so the politicians begin to feel the heat. So we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for driving this story.
Thank you so much, Adam, again, for your work. It's my honor to help amplify your message. Thank you. So
real quick, tell us what's coming down the pike shortly. Tell us about Outnumbered and what's coming down the pike shortly on the show.
Oh, thank you for that. So Outnumbered is every day at noon ET on Fox News, and we cover breaking news, and hopefully we'll be looking forward to covering your next illuminating breaking news coming out of Open the Books. I'll be looking forward to that, and we'll amplify it then as well.
So a couple things for everybody watching the program. On Instagram, follow Emily's page on Instagram. Her handle is @real Emily Compadio. So go to Instagram and follow her page and be a part of what's driving great stories. The second thing is go to openthebooks.com. If you haven't signed our petition to read the bill, this massive infrastructure bill is in front of Congress right now, and really nobody has had the time. They started taking votes, and nobody even had the text of the bill. We need to urge Congress and force Congress to start reading the bill. As you know, it's been turned into legislation in the Senate by U.S. Senator from Florida, Rick Scott. So please sign our petition and become a part of the tens of thousands of Americans that are on that petition. But first off, before you do that, go to Instagram, follow Emily, @real Emily Compadio. Thank you very much for joining us on this week's segment of the Ripoff of the Week. And Emily, thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. Have a great day. Thank you again.